The punch came out of nowhere. Blake Morrison's fist connected with the new girl's cheek in the middle of Westfield High's packed cafeteria at exactly 12:37 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. 300 students watched in stunned silence as phones shot up like lightning rods, capturing every second. But something was wrong with this picture. The girl, Roselene Hayes, didn't crumble, didn't cry, didn't even stagger backward more than half a step. Instead, she lowered her shoulders slightly, exhaled in a measured 4-count rhythm, and fixed Blake with the kind of calm, calculating stare that should have made him very, very nervous. "In 5 minutes," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the cafeteria's shocked silence, "you're going to wish you'd chosen someone else." The way she fell wasn't clumsy. It was controlled, precise, like every movement had been drilled to perfection. Blake Morrison ruled Westfield High School like his personal kingdom, and everyone knew it. The 17-year-old son of Richard Morrison, Colorado Springs school board member and major district donor, had never met a problem his family's money and influence couldn't solve. His thick brown hair was perfectly styled, his varsity jacket spotless, and his smile carried the kind of confidence that only came from 15 years of never facing real consequences. Across from him stood Roselene Hayes, 18 years old and 3 weeks new to Colorado. She'd transferred in on a full scholarship, one of those academic merit cases that made the wealthy families uncomfortable. While Blake wore designer clothes that cost more than most families' monthly grocery bills, Roselene carried a slightly worn backpack and notebooks that had definitely seen previous owners. But there were things about Roselene that didn't quite add up. Like the pen in her left pocket, a basic ballpoint that felt unusually heavy when she wrote, as if there were components inside beyond simple ink. Or the way she always positioned herself with her back against walls in the cafeteria, maintaining clear sight lines to every exit within a 30-degree observation angle. The contradiction was stark. Scholarship money versus legacy wealth, hard work versus inherited privilege, silence versus arrogance. "Look what we have here," Blake announced, his voice carrying across the cafeteria with practiced authority. "Another charity case taking up space that real students earned." His crew, 3 other varsity athletes, whose families also happened to be major school donors, laughed on cue. They'd been doing this dance for years, and Blake always led. Roselene calmly took another measured bite of her lunch, then set down her fork. "Colorado state law allows one-party consent for recordings," she said conversationally, as if commenting on the weather. The statement hung in the air for a moment. Most students had no idea what she meant, but something about the way she said it, casual, confident, like she knew exactly which legal precedents applied, made a few people shift uncomfortably. Blake's grin faltered for just a second before returning full force. He had no idea that the Morrison Family Foundation had been funneling money through Westfield High's scholarship program for years, creating fake student profiles and pocketing the difference. He just knew that Daddy's donations meant teachers looked the other way when Blake's temper flared. 3 minutes until the bell rings," someone called out, checking the wall clock. The countdown had begun. Blake's confidence surged back. "You think you're smart, scholarship girl? Let me explain how things work around here." He pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the screen. "See, we have this group chat, really popular. And I think everyone needs to see just how pathetic the new girl really is." Within seconds, a meme appeared on dozens of screens across the cafeteria. It was a photo of Roselene from her first day, edited with text that read, "Free lunch special, comes with side of desperation." The image spread like wildfire through the school's social network, students sharing and commenting faster than teachers could monitor. But Roselene did something unexpected. As Blake's crew laughed and pointed, she smoothly transferred her lunch tray from her right hand to her left, keeping her dominant hand completely free. The movement was so fluid, so practiced, that most people missed it entirely. Emma Rodriguez noticed, though. The 16-year-old junior had been watching this unfold with growing concern, and something about Roselene's body language reminded her of her cousin Miguel, who'd served 2 tours overseas. There was a readiness there, a professional awareness that didn't belong to a typical high school transfer student. "This is getting out of control," Emma whispered to her friend Sarah, but her voice was lost in the crowd's murmurs. Before we see just how much Blake is about to regret his choices, take a moment to hit that like button to support stories of justice like this one. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our latest videos. You can also click the thanks button to support our team in bringing you these stories. Now, let's see exactly how Blake is going to pay for his mistakes. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period, but the tension was just beginning. As students filed out of the cafeteria, Roselene's phone buzzed with a text from an unlisted number. "Package confirmed." She glanced at the message, then deleted it without responding. Most transfer students didn't receive encrypted communications from unknown sources, but, then again, most transfer students weren't conducting federal investigations. What Blake and his friends didn't know was that Roselene Hayes understood Colorado Springs school district policies better than most of the faculty. She knew the exact procedure for Title IX complaints, the chain of command for reporting misconduct, and the specific documentation requirements for building a legal case. For someone who'd supposedly just arrived from out of state, she demonstrated an unusually detailed knowledge of local educational law. Emma Rodriguez was starting to put pieces together that didn't quite fit. "How does she know so much about the district policies?" Emma asked her friend. "My mom's been on the PTA for 5 years, and she doesn't know half that stuff." The truth was that someone had been monitoring Westfield High School for weeks, tracking financial irregularities in the scholarship program and documenting a pattern of administrative cover-ups. Someone was feeding Roselene information, but the question was, who? During 4th period, Blake's harassment escalated to the next level. He cornered Roselene at her locker, deliberately knocking her books to the floor and stepping on her chemistry homework. "Oops," he said with mock innocence. "Maybe, if you weren't so clumsy, accidents like this wouldn't happen." But instead of getting upset or fighting back, Roselene did something that caught Blake completely off guard. She pulled out her phone and methodically photographed the scene from 3 different angles, capturing the timestamp, the scattered books, and Blake's position relative to the damage. She noted the exact time, 2:43 p.m., and made a quick voice memo establishing the chain of custody for the evidence. "What the hell are you doing?" Blake demanded, suddenly less confident. "Documenting," Roselene replied simply, continuing her systematic photography. She moved like someone who'd done this before, someone who understood that evidence needed to be collected properly to hold up in court. Blake's crew exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't how victims usually responded. Most kids either fought back or ran away crying. This calculated professional approach to documentation was something entirely different. The systematic way Roselene collected evidence suggested training that went far beyond typical high school preparation. She understood chain of custody procedures, proper photographic documentation, and legal requirements for admissible evidence. These weren't skills learned in AP history class. Meanwhile, the harassment continued to escalate. Blake started a rumor campaign, spreading lies about Roselene's background and her family's financial situation. The gossip mill churned with increasingly vicious stories, each one designed to isolate and humiliate the transfer student. But Roselene had begun collecting evidence in ways that Blake couldn't even imagine. She was recording audio with timestamp authentication, preserving email header chains that revealed the digital fingerprints behind anonymous messages, and cross-referencing attendance metadata with the timing of various incidents. Her knowledge of Colorado state law was becoming more apparent with each interaction. When Blake's friend tried to intimidate her in the hallway, Roselene casually mentioned that Title IX procedures in this district require mandatory reporting within 24 hours of documented harassment. The specificity of her legal knowledge was starting to make people nervous. Emma Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Roselene than met the eye. She knows things, Emma told her boyfriend after school, like things she shouldn't know if she just moved here. That afternoon, the situation took a dangerous turn. Blake sent Roselene a direct message through social media, and this time the threat was explicit. Transfer schools or transfer to the hospital. Your choice. Charity case. But Roselene was ready. She activated audio timestamp recording, preserved the complete email header chain showing the message's origin and routing, and used basic OSINT techniques to trace the phone number's area code and correlate it with the timing of Blake's known schedule. Then, something interesting happened. Roselene received a phone call from someone identified only as Handler in her contacts. The call lasted exactly 37 seconds, but students nearby heard only one word before she stepped away. Confirmation. Who was Roselene reporting to? And why did a high school transfer student have a contact listed as Handler? The next day brought another escalation. Blake used his family's connections to manipulate Roselene's class schedule, getting her moved to different lunch periods and study halls in an attempt to isolate her socially. But instead of being discouraged, Roselene documented every administrative change, noting the timing, the personnel involved, and the irregular nature of mid-semester schedule modifications. She was also noticing things that other students missed, like the fact that board meeting schedules kept appearing and disappearing from the main office bulletin board with unusual frequency. Someone was manipulating administrative processes, and Roselene was tracking every irregularity. The harassment was clearly escalating toward physical confrontation. Blake's threats were becoming more direct. His crew was getting bolder, and the school administration seemed curiously reluctant to intervene despite multiple documented incidents. But Roselene had begun demonstrating skills that no ordinary transfer student should possess. When Blake's friend tried to grab her backpack in the hallway, she smoothly redirected his momentum using techniques that looked suspiciously like professional combat training. The movement was so quick and controlled that most witnesses missed it, but Emma Rodriguez caught the whole thing. That wasn't luck, Emma told her friend later. That was training, real training. Roselene was also showing an unusual understanding of surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques. She knew which hallway cameras had blind spots, understood the security guard rotation schedule, and could predict exactly when certain areas would be monitored versus unobserved. During chemistry class, she casually mentioned that forensic evidence requires specific handling procedures to maintain admissibility, then demonstrated knowledge of evidence preservation techniques that impressed even the teacher. Blake was starting to realize that his usual intimidation tactics weren't working, but instead of backing down, he decided to escalate further. He gathered his crew for what he called one final lesson for the scholarship girl who didn't know her place. He had no idea that Roselene Hayes had been collecting evidence for 3 weeks, building a comprehensive case file that included audio recordings, photographic documentation, digital forensics, and witness statements. Everything had been preserved according to law enforcement standards, with proper chain of custody documentation and timestamp authentication. More importantly, Blake had no idea who Roselene really was, or why a high school student carried herself like a federal agent conducting an undercover investigation. The confrontation was coming, and Blake Morrison was about to discover that he'd chosen the wrong target at exactly the wrong time. But first, he'd have to learn that some people fight back with handcuffs instead of fists, and that the most dangerous opponents are often the ones who look like easy victims. The real question wasn't whether Blake would face consequences for his actions. It was whether he'd understand the full scope of what he'd walked into before the federal agents finished building their case. The final confrontation came on Friday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks and 2 days after Roselene Hayes had first walked through Westfield High's doors. Blake Morrison had gathered his crew in the gymnasium after school, confident that the security cameras would be conveniently offline for maintenance, another favor his father's donations had quietly arranged. He'd pushed this harassment campaign as far as verbal threats and social humiliation could go. Now it was time for what he called a physical lesson in respect. But as Blake and his 3 friends cornered Roselene near the equipment storage room, she pulled out a communication device that definitely wasn't standard student equipment. The encrypted tactical radio was designed for federal law enforcement operations, featuring secure channels, location tracking, and direct connectivity to field operations centers that coordinated multi-agency investigations. "What the hell is that thing?" Blake demanded, his confidence wavering for the first time. Roselene calmly activated the device. "Backup coordination system," she said matter-of-factly. "Standard protocol for field operations requiring immediate response capability and evidence chain integration." The scope of the investigation Blake had unknowingly walked into was becoming clear. This wasn't just about school bullying. This was about a financial crime network that crossed county lines and potentially involved federal jurisdiction. Roselene's mission had uncovered evidence of systematic fraud involving multiple school districts and millions in misdirected federal education funding. Blake's desperation reached its peak. "I don't care what kind of weird tech you've got, charity girl. You're about to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong family." He lunged forward, throwing his second punch of the month, the one that would change everything. What do you think Blake's reaction will be when he discovers Roselene's true identity? Leave a comment with your prediction. Roselene's response was immediate and devastating. She caught Blake's fist mid-swing with a blocking technique so precise and professional that everyone in the room went silent. The movement wasn't lucky or instinctive. It was textbook defensive tactics, executed with the kind of muscle memory that came from hundreds of hours of federal law enforcement training. As Blake stumbled backward, screaming in shock and pain, the sleeve of Roselene's jacket pulled back slightly, revealing a thin scar across her wrist, the kind of mark left by intensive close-quarters combat training. More importantly, it revealed the edge of something that definitely wasn't a student ID badge. "Agent Hayes, HSI Task Force," Roselene said calmly, her entire demeanor shifting from high school student to federal law enforcement officer. "My mission here was to investigate the money laundering operation your family has been running through fraudulent scholarship programs." Blake's scream echoed through the gymnasium as the full implications hit him. HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, only got involved when crimes crossed state lines or involved federal funding. This wasn't a simple bullying incident anymore. While Blake and his friends stood frozen in shock, Roselene continued her explanation with professional detachment. "For 3 weeks, I've been documenting not just your harassment, but your family's systematic theft of federal education dollars. Every threat you made, every attempt to manipulate school systems, every abuse of administrative privilege, all of it has been recorded and preserved according to federal evidence standards." The gymnasium doors burst open, as Blake made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation through violence. He and his crew tried to surround Roselene, but she demonstrated crowd management techniques that sent them all backing away without her having to throw a single punch. "Step back 2 paces," she commanded, with an authority that made everyone in the room immediately comply. Her positioning allowed the security cameras, which weren't actually offline, to capture the entire incident from multiple angles, providing the clear video evidence that would support federal charges. Emma Rodriguez, who had been hiding behind the bleachers documenting everything on her phone, finally understood what she'd been witnessing for weeks. This wasn't a transfer student getting bullied. This was a federal agent conducting an undercover investigation, and Blake Morrison had walked directly into a federal crime. The real chaos began when Principal Martinez burst into the gymnasium, followed by 2 men in dark suits, who definitely weren't school district employees. Blake's face went white as he realized that his family's corruption had attracted the attention of federal investigators operating at levels far beyond local school board influence. "Blake Morrison," one of the agents announced, "you're under arrest for assault on a federal agent, conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, and accessory to wire fraud involving federal education funding." But Blake's arrest was just the beginning. As handcuffs clicked into place, his phone rang. It was his father, Richard Morrison, calling from his own federal custody. The elder Morrison had been arrested simultaneously at a school board meeting, where HSI agents had presented evidence of the multi-million-dollar scholarship fraud scheme that had been operating for over 5 years. The scope of the Morrison family's crimes was staggering. They'd created dozens of fake student profiles, submitted fraudulent scholarship applications using stolen identities, and pocketed federal education grants intended for legitimate low-income students. The operation had stolen nearly $2 million from programs designed to help students like the ones Blake had spent weeks mocking as charity cases. Emma Rodriguez watched in amazement as the truth unfolded. "Holy cow," she whispered to herself. She was a federal agent the whole time. The investigation revealed connections to similar schemes in Denver and Fort Collins, suggesting a network of corruption that extended far beyond Colorado Springs. What had started as a single high school bullying incident had exposed a multi-district conspiracy involving dozens of corrupt officials and millions in stolen federal funding. Roselene's systematic evidence collection over 3 weeks had provided federal prosecutors with everything they needed: audio recordings with authenticated timestamps, digital forensics showing the routing of threatened messages, photographic documentation of administrative manipulation, and witness statements from students who had observed the pattern of harassment and cover-ups. As Blake was led away in handcuffs, still struggling to comprehend how completely his world had collapsed, Roselene finally allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Justice had been served not through violence or revenge, but through professional investigation and federal law enforcement. The school board meeting that evening was unlike anything Westfield High had ever seen. Principal Martinez, who had been unknowingly pressured to cover up Blake's previous incidents, testified before federal investigators about the systematic way the Morrison family had manipulated school policies to protect their son while stealing from federal programs. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. Local news stations picked up the story within hours, reporting on the dramatic arrest of both father and son Morrison. Social media exploded with students sharing their own stories of Blake's protected harassment, now understanding why their complaints had been quietly buried by administration. But the story was far from over. As Roselene prepared to leave Westfield High School, having completed her mission successfully, a black SUV with government plates pulled up to the school entrance. The man who stepped out wasn't wearing the standard HSI identification that Roselene expected. She watched him approach with careful attention, noting that his credentials seemed legitimate, but his presence hadn't been cleared through normal channels. In federal investigations, unexpected arrivals often meant either backup support or complications that required immediate assessment. "Agent Hayes," the man called out, "we need to discuss Denver." Roselene's expression shifted from satisfaction to concern. The Denver connection had been mentioned in her reports, but if federal agents were arriving unannounced, it meant the investigation had uncovered something larger and potentially more dangerous than the Colorado Springs operation. As she walked toward the SUV, Emma Rodriguez called out from across the parking lot, "Will we see you again?" Roselene turned back with a slight smile that held both gratitude and regret. She'd grown genuinely fond of Emma and some of the other students, but maintaining her cover had meant deceiving people who'd tried to befriend her. "Take care of yourself, Emma," she said simply. "And remember, sometimes the quiet ones are fighting battles you can't see." The resolution was swift and comprehensive. Blake Morrison pled guilty to federal assault charges and received 2 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Richard Morrison was sentenced to 8 years for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, a sentence that sent shockwaves through corruption networks in school districts across Colorado. The scholarship programs were completely restructured with new oversight mechanisms to prevent future fraud. Dozens of legitimate students finally received the funding that had been stolen from them, and several other corrupt officials in neighboring districts resigned rather than face federal investigation. But as Roselene climbed into the government SUV, the driver mentioned something that made her realize the Morrison case had been just the beginning. Reports of similar operations were surfacing in Denver, Fort Collins, and possibly extending into neighboring states. The network was larger than anyone had initially suspected. "Colorado Springs is finished," the driver said as they pulled away from Westfield High School. "But Denver is going to be much harder." As the SUV disappeared down the road, students and faculty were left to process what they'd witnessed. A federal investigation that had exposed corruption at the highest levels of their school district, delivered justice to a protected bully, and revealed that sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones who look like easy targets. The quiet transfer student with the scholarship had turned out to be a federal agent with handcuffs, and Blake Morrison's reign of protected harassment had ended with the sound of steel clicking shut around his wrists. But in the distance, Denver's skyline promised new challenges, new corruption to uncover, and new battles for justice that would require Agent Roselene Hayes to once again become someone else entirely.
The story ends here, but there are many more videos waiting for you. So, if you enjoy, please take a moment to like, subscribe to the Wrong Target Story channel, and don't forget to turn on the bell. See you in the next story.